ClancyPasta presents Unsuspecting Prey, written by Kale and Ryan 13. The jungle was dark and still. The leaves blew in the tropical breeze, and Sten Cooper crept through the rainforest trails. He had nothing but the dim moonlight shining through the canopy to guide him, and so he stalked the night, his stomach shrinking, pins and needles stabbing his body. His entire crew had already been killed. The Amazon didn't take kindly to trespassers. Sten did his best not to cry, not be scared by what happened, but both were impossible. His hair stood on end at every croak, every groan, every twig snapping off in the distance. When him and his crew had first come to the Amazon, they talked about how welcoming it felt and how exciting the place was. They, despite having years of research and field experience, only had a basic knowledge of the Amazonian predators, though. Something rustled behind him. Jaguar, perhaps? He pondered, feeling like a protective, warm blanket had just wrapped itself around him. He knew how quickly that blanket could be torn away, though. He stopped, going still. His hands shook, his breath caged in his lungs as he tried not to breathe too sharply or squeal. He waited. He thought if he waited any longer, he'd collapse. There was something there, but Sten didn't know that yet. Even though he expected to die, he was just unsuspecting prey, a fish on a hook ready to be pulled out of the water. Sten knew if he didn't escape the jungle alive, the beast would claim 1,000 more lives. Someone has to hunt that thing down, Sten had thought to himself earlier that day. He thought about how Atchison had been ripped open from the stomach, gutted, and then hung from the trees by his own intestines as the rest of his organs were consumed, the brain matter slurped from his corpse like soup. That was only one of many creative ways the creature liked to feast and then display its prize. Poor Atchison, he thought. Sten remembered watching the monster as it stuck a thin appendage up Atchison's bloody mouth, then began to suck out the brain matter, crushing his skull. Sten had thanked God multiple times for sparing him. He waited up in a tree for hours, then climbed back down as the sun was setting, painting the sky orange. Sten had spent a lot of time trying to study the landscape and remember if he had already passed through the area or not. It looked familiar enough to him. He didn't know that he was miles away from land that him and his team had previously explored. The expedition crew had gone miles in on a journey to find new species. Cruelly ironic, Sten thought, because that's just what we found. He let out a weak sob and suppressed it. He remembered O'Sullivan's ramblings as they first entered the jungle. Always save the crying for when it's all over. I never shed a tear until Abigail took every last thing that I owned and the fight was totally over. The thing watched Sten from up in the trees like it was a cat stalking a mouse. It almost wanted to pity the poor creature. The hunger pangs began to roll in. Without the right intake of calories every hour, it would die. The monster paused and waited, decided to taunt Sten. He rustled the branches of a nearby tree, and Sten whipped his head around, eyes wide open. He stopped once more, hunched over like he was an animal himself. The brute thought Sten looked like a caveman. It had eaten thousands of those in its lifetime. Sten couldn't see the beast yet, but he was beginning to sense that it was there. His breathing started to quicken, as did his pulse. His head felt light, and he knew he was going to die, but adrenaline was pouring through his veins now, and his legs, as weak as they are, felt like machine pistons. Sten started to sprint. His machine piston legs carried him far. The monster gave him a head start, knowing he would be helpless either way. Games gave the monster something to entertain itself with. After eons of life, the beast had gotten tired of the hunt and got creative. Sten bounded over a log outlined in the silvery moonlight. When he landed, his speed almost doubled. His legs were sore. his lungs heaved. He thought his head and heart might explode. Sten knew something was there, but wasn't sure what. There was an itch in the back of his mind. The thing. Sten prayed he wouldn't end up like Atchison, like Reed, like Gardner, and like O'Sullivan. So, he picked up his speed. The creature didn't do anything to announce its presence. Instead, it kept lurching forward. It stretched a long, spindly limb from branch to branch of each tree. It stalked through the canopies, drawing closer. It was careful not to make a sound or alert Sten at all. This continued on for some time. Sten's pace continued to grow faster. The monster thought to itself, I might be a little too old, and he might be a little too young. Sten was losing breath, dreading the thought of stopping. He started to slow down. The creature's stomach growled as it watched the little explorer dropping in speed before he came to a complete stop. Sten stood there, scanning the trees. One half of his brain warned him that he needed to keep running. The other was trying to rationalize with him. He didn't see anything in the tree line. He figured he'd just encountered a small animal, but he continued to wait until he was positive. The frogs croaked, and the wind blew a little stronger than usual. Nothing but the sounds of the jungle and the soft rain pattering against the leaves. There were a few rattling noises. Sten studied the tree line again. Nothing. He had that dreamy, drifting feeling one gets while debating whether or not they should be afraid. Something moved above him. Sten didn't notice at all, and instead, he continued to walk. He had nothing but the slightest clue as to what was going to happen next when he moved on, walking down a small clearing. He gripped tree branches just to be sure he was walking in the right direction, unable to see anything. A few birds howled at something, and he thought they may have just been attacked. Sten pondered if it might have been the creature, though he realized they wouldn't have had time to squawk. They would have just been swallowed whole in the beast's massive jaws. The leaves shook, and Sten murmured to himself, "Has to be the wind." He was unaware that he'd entered the denial state. Death had coiled itself around him, but he didn't want to believe that it was there yet. The jungle fell tranquil again. No frogs croaked, and no monkeys howled. Sten paused. The jungle seemed to pause with him. Spindly limbs started to reach down from the canopy. Sten did not notice. He continued to walk. One of the thin appendages tapped on his shoulder, and he spun around, thinking it might have been one of his former crewmates. "Hello?" he whispered. Nobody was there. Instead, he was met with a skinny leg that wrapped around his throat. It started to strangle him. Sten's screams came out as choked cries. A limb was forced down his throat. Now the true suffocation began. Sten felt the cold gloom seeping into his body. The humidity and the warm tingles that tore through him could not get rid of the icy sensation in his chest. His head started to get light. Sten thrashed around. He flailed his arms and prayed. He tried to pray aloud, but no sound escaped except for wheezes. His last thought was, someone needs to kill this thing. Sten wouldn't get his way, and he knew this just as he gasped out his last breath. His eyes popped from the sockets and fell on the ground, landing with two soft thuds. His face was being red, and his lungs were empty. His head was lighter than ever, then impossibly heavy. He drowned in darkness and went limp like a rag doll. The creature clapped for itself. Not old enough, it thought. Now, it started to suck the brain matter out of Sten through the tube it placed inside the mouth. Using a clawed arm, it sliced open Sten's chest, bones cracking and snapping loudly with the maneuver. A waterfall of blood poured out, painting Sten's clothes crimson. Using a pair of hands, the beast began to pull out organs and carried them to its enormous jaws, dropping them into its mouth and chewing. The organs crunched and popped, saliva dripping from its fangs. When the creature was done feasting, it hacked Sten up into tiny morsels and pulled its 32 different arms, legs, hands, and claws back into the canopy, stretched and started to flow from tree to tree, hanging in the space between the jungle and the sky above. From all around it, in a flurry of shaking leaves and rustling sounds, came its hundreds of different siblings. Sten had only met one. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. I want to give a huge thanks to all of my supporters over at Patreon and YouTube memberships. Your support makes these narrations possible, and I appreciate it a ton. If you'd like to join these lovely ghouls, you can head on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/clancypasta, or click the join button below to become a member. And if you'd like creepy cool shirts, make sure to head on over and check out my official merch store for some awesome tees, hoodies, stickers, and more. Alright. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great night. Cheers.